When humanity is humiliated by the Galactic Council and cast aside as primitive, they withdraw from the galactic stage only to reveal just how dependent the galaxy truly is on their strength, ingenuity, and resilience. The Great Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council stretched across 3 kilometers of polished obsidian, its crystalline dome reflecting the light of 1,000 distant stars. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the center of the circular chamber, her simple earth-made suit stark against the elaborate bioluminescent robes and exotic carapaces of the council members who towered above her on their tiered platforms. "The human speaks," announced Councillor Xthai, his forearms gesturing dismissively as his translator rendered his words into perfect English. "Tell us, little primate, why should we grant your species full membership in our council when you have barely learned to leave your own star system?" Elena's jaw tightened, but she maintained her diplomatic composure. "Honored councilors, humanity has much to offer the galactic community. Our scientific innovations, our cultural diversity, our determination to explore and learn." A sound like grinding metal interrupted her. It was laughter from Councillor Vorthak, the silicon-based representative whose species had mastered faster than light travel when humans were still discovering fire. "Determination? You mean stubbornness. Your species fights wars over patches of dirt and colored cloth. You poison your own atmosphere for profit. You are children playing with fusion reactors." The other council members joined in, and what Elena could only interpret as mockery, a symphony of clicks, hums, and harmonic frequencies that her translator couldn't fully render. She felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger, but forced herself to remain standing straight. "We acknowledge our past mistakes," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the humiliation. "But we've learned from them, we've united our world, ended global poverty, and begun healing our environment. We've proven we can change, grow, become better than we were." Councillor Quelinara, whose jellyfish-like form pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, spoke in a voice like wind chimes. "Change, growth. We have observed your species for 3,000 of your years. You are the same violent, territorial, short-sighted creatures you have always been. The only difference is that now you can bring your violence to the stars." Elder Councillor Mhandar, ancient even by the standards of his long-lived species, raised a crystalline appendage for silence. His voice carried the weight of eons when he spoke. "The human delegation will be granted probationary status. You may observe our proceedings, but you have no voice in our decisions. Perhaps in another 1,000 years, when you have learned to control your aggressive impulses, we will reconsider." Elena's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Probationary status. After everything we've accomplished, after the medical advances we've shared, the peaceful first contact protocols we've established with 17 different species, the refugee colonies we've helped establish." "Enough." Mhandar's voice cut through her words like a blade through silk. "Your species' few accomplishments are overshadowed by your fundamental nature. You are predators, apex killers from a death world. You wage war as easily as you breathe." The council has spoken. The session ended with the thunderous sound of the council's approval, a cacophony that followed Elena as she walked the long path back to the chamber's exit. Behind her, she could hear the casual conversation of beings who had just dismissed her entire species as unworthy of equal treatment. But what the council didn't know, what they couldn't know from their observations and their certainty of superiority, was that they had just made the gravest mistake in galactic history. They had humiliated humanity in front of the entire galaxy, and word of this insult would spread to every human colony, every Earth fleet, every frontier settlement where humans had carved out their place among the stars. The news of the council's decision spread through human space like wildfire through dry grass. On Mars, the mining union stopped their work and gathered in the red dust of the colony squares. On Europa Station, the deep space explorers who had mapped more of the galaxy than any other species put down their star charts and listened in stunned silence. In the asteroid belt, The tough-as-nails miners and salvage crews who had turned the solar system's debris into humanity's first stellar empire felt something they hadn't experienced in generations. Unified rage. Dr. Sarah Chen, head of the Terran Research Consortium, stood before the emergency session of the Human Colonial Council. Her presentation showed the humiliating footage from the Galactic Council chambers, Ambassador Vasquez's dignified responses, and the casual dismissal of humanity's achievements. They called us children, Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium. They said we're too violent, too primitive, too aggressive to deserve a seat at their table. They've watched us for 3,000 years and decided we're incapable of growth, incapable of change, incapable of being anything more than what we've always been. General Marcus Torres, the grizzled veteran who had led the successful defense of Kepler for Ford to be against the Rigel pirates, stood up from his seat. Maybe they're right about one thing. Maybe we are what we've always been. Maybe it's time we reminded the galaxy exactly what that means. The murmur of agreement that rippled through the assembly was like the growl of a waking predator. These were the descendants of explorers who had crossed oceans in wooden ships, who had walked on alien moons, who had built cities in the vacuum of space. They were the children of warriors who had fought for freedom on 1,000 battlefields, who had united a fractured world through determination and will. What are you suggesting, General? Asked Director Liu Wei from the Centauri colonies. Torres' smile was sharp as a blade. I'm suggesting we give them exactly what they expect. They want to see the aggressive, territorial, short-sighted creatures they think we are. Fine. Let's show them what happens when you corner a predator from a death world. The meeting that followed was unlike any in human history. Not since the dark days of the corporate wars had humanity's leaders gathered with such grim purpose. But this time, they weren't fighting each other. This time, they had a common enemy, the arrogance of species who had grown comfortable in their superiority. The plan that emerged from that meeting was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying. In its scope, humanity would withdraw from all galactic trade agreements. Human colonies would cease all cooperation with Council species. Human explorers would abandon their joint mapping expeditions. Human medical researchers would end their collaboration on interspecies diseases, but that was just the beginning. They think we're violent? Asked Captain Rivera, whose merchant fleet had been transporting goods for a dozen species across the Orion Arm. Let them see what happens when we stop protecting their trade routes from pirates. They think we're territorial, asked Administrator Petrov from the Vega settlements. Let them try to maintain their mining operations without our security forces. They think we're short-sighted, asked Dr. Okafor, whose research teams had been working on the climate restoration of 3 different worlds. Let them solve their own environmental crises. The withdrawal began immediately. Human security forces protecting Council trade routes received new orders. Return to human space immediately. Human medical teams treating plagues on alien worlds packed their equipment and left. Human engineers maintaining the hyperspace relay networks that connected the Council's far-flung territories simply walked away from their posts. At first, the Council barely noticed. They had always seen humanity as junior partners, useful but not essential. It would take time for them to realize that the children they had dismissed had grown into the backbone of galactic civilization. 3 months after humanity's withdrawal from galactic cooperation, the first cracks in the Council's perfect order began to show. The Vegan Trade Consortium's quarterly report showed a 60% increase in piracy along the Outer Rim routes. The Sirius Medical Institute reported that the phage outbreak on Kepler 1649c was now beyond their ability to contain. The Rigel Mining Collective's operations in the Horse Head Nebula had been attacked 17 times in the past month. Counselor Zex Thai stood before the emergency session of the Inner Council, his forearms gesturing frantically as he read from a holographic display. The situation is deteriorating rapidly. The humans have withdrawn all their security forces from our trade routes. Piracy has increased by 300% in the past month alone. It's worse than that. Counselor Vorthak's grinding voice carried a note of concern that would have been unthinkable months ago. The hyperspace relay network is failing. Without human maintenance crews, we're losing connection to 30% of our outer colonies. Elder Counselor Mhandar remained silent, his ancient form motionless on his crystalline platform. But the younger council members could see the tension in his posture, the way his sensory organs focused intently on the reports flooding in from across the galaxy. Perhaps, suggested Counselor Quelanara, her bioluminescent patterns flickering with uncertainty, we should consider reaching out to the humans. Offer them some form of limited partnership. No, Mhandar's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. We will not be extorted by primitives. We managed the galaxy for millions of years before they crawled out of their caves. We will manage it again. But even as he spoke, more reports were arriving. The Tau Ceti medical emergency was spreading to 3 more systems. The Betelgeuse mining operation had lost contact with their security detail. The archaeological expedition to the precursor ruins had been attacked by unknown raiders, and their distress calls were going unanswered because the comm relay network was down. On the human colony world of New Geneva, Admiral Sarah Kim watched the Council's emergency broadcasts with grim satisfaction. Her staff had been monitoring galactic communications for months, watching as the carefully maintained order of the Council's civilization began to crumble. The Altair system is requesting emergency assistance, reported Commander Jackson, her intelligence officer. Their main trade hub is under siege by 3 different pirate fleets, and their response. Admiral Kim asked, they're offering to pay us triple standard rates for a single security patrol. Kim's smile was cold. Remind them that we're just violent primitives who can't be trusted with galactic security. Surely they can handle a few pirates with their superior technology and wisdom. Across human space, the same conversation was playing out. Council worlds that had barely acknowledged humanity's existence were now desperately calling for help. Alien species that had nodded along with the Council's dismissive attitude were discovering that their comfortable lives had been built on the backs of human labor and protection. The Procyon colony, whose inhabitants had publicly supported the Council's decision to grant humanity only probationary status, found their atmospheric processors failing. The human engineering teams they had dismissed as adequate for simple tasks were suddenly nowhere to be found, and their own engineers couldn't figure out how to repair the alien technology they had relied on. The Centauri Archaeological Consortium, which had excluded human researchers from their expeditions for being too aggressive in their methods, watched helplessly as their sites were overrun by treasure hunters and artifact thieves. The human security forces that had quietly protected their digs for decades were gone, and their replacement teams lasted an average of 3 days before being overwhelmed. But it was the medical crisis that truly shook the Council's confidence. The phage, a virulent disease that had been contained to a single world, began spreading through the galactic community. Human medical teams had been working on treatments for years, but their research had been dismissed as crude by the more advanced Council species. Now, as the death toll mounted and the phage jumped from world to world, the Council's own medical experts found themselves helpless. Their sophisticated treatments, designed for their own biologies, were useless against a disease that attacked the fundamental building blocks of organic life. We need the human research, admitted Dr. Velteran, the Council's chief medical officer, during a closed session. Their crude methods may be the only thing that can stop this plague. Then contact them, ordered Counselors Exthai. We already did. They said they're too busy protecting their own people to worrying about the rest of the galaxy. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in millennia, the Council faced a problem they couldn't solve, and the only solution lay in the hands of the species they had dismissed as unworthy primitives. 6 months after the Council's fateful decision, the galaxy was in chaos. The carefully maintained order that had existed for millions of years was crumbling, and the Council members who had presided over it with such arrogance were learning a harsh lesson about the nature of power. The Vegan Trade Consortium had collapsed entirely. Without human security forces to protect their trade routes, piracy had grown from a minor nuisance to an existential threat. Entire fleets of merchant vessels had been captured or destroyed, and the exotic goods that had flowed freely between worlds for centuries were now too dangerous to transport. The Procyon colony was evacuating its population to orbital habitats as their atmosphere became increasingly toxic. The Centauri Archaeological Consortium had lost contact with 7 of their 12 expedition sites, the Rigel mining collectives. Operations in the outer systems had been completely overrun by raiders, but it was the phage that truly demonstrated the galaxy's dependence on humanity. The disease had now spread to over 100 worlds, and the death toll was approaching the billions. The Council's advanced medical technology, which had been the pride of their civilization, was useless against a pathogen that attacked the quantum structure of biological matter. In the emergency session of the Grand Council, Councillor X stood before his peers with the bearing of a being who had aged decades in the past 6 months. His forearms, once so confident in their dismissive gestures, now trembled with exhaustion and fear. "The situation is beyond critical," he announced to the assembled representatives. "We have lost contact with 30% of our member worlds. The hyperspace relay network has collapsed in 12 sectors. The phage has spread to systems we thought were safely isolated, and our medical teams are helpless to stop it." Councillor Vorthak's silicon-based form had lost its usual imposing presence. The confidence that had once made him seem like a living mountain now seemed like nothing more than brittle pride. "The humans have our research data. They've been working on treatments for years while we dismiss their efforts as primitive. They may be our only hope." Hope. Elder Councillor Mhandar's voice carried the weight of eons, but now it also carried something else: defeat. "You speak of hope from a species we deemed unworthy of full membership, from creatures we called children and primitives, the ancient being's sensory organs focused on the holographic displays showing the galaxy's deteriorating situation. Entire sectors were going dark as civilizations that had thrived for millennia collapsed without the support systems they had taken for granted. Perhaps," Mhandar continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "we were the children. Perhaps we were the ones who failed to understand the true nature of the galaxy we claimed to govern." The admission sent shockwaves through the assembled council. For millions of years, these beings had seen themselves as the guardians of galactic civilization, the wise overseers who guided younger species toward enlightenment. The idea that they had been wrong, that they had been dependent on the very species they had dismissed, was almost impossible to accept. But the evidence was undeniable. The galaxy was dying without humanity's involvement, and they were the only species with the knowledge and resources to save it. "We must contact the humans," Councillor Quelanara said, her bioluminescent patterns flickering with patterns of submission that no council member had ever displayed before. "We must ask for their help." "Ask?" Mhandar's laugh was like the sound of breaking crystal. "We, who have ruled the galaxy for eons, must ask the primitives for help. We must beg the children to save us from our own arrogance." The council chamber fell silent as the full weight of their situation became clear. They had created their own crisis through their prejudice and superiority. They had dismissed humanity not because humans were unworthy, but because admitting their worth would have meant acknowledging their own dependence. On Terra, in the same assembly hall where Dr. Chen had shown the footage of humanity's humiliation, the leaders of human space gathered once again. But this time, they were not planning their response to an insult. They were deciding the fate of a galaxy. "The Council has finally sent an official request," reported Ambassador Vasquez, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "They're asking for our help with the phage crisis, the piracy situation, and the infrastructure failures." Asking. General Torres' smile was sharp as a blade. "Or demanding." Asking, very politely. "They've offered to pay us for our services, to provide us with full council membership, to give us representation proportional to our contribution to galactic civilization." The assembled leaders looked at each other with expressions that ranged from grim satisfaction to outright vindication. They had proved their point in the most devastating way possible, by showing the galaxy what it looked like without them. And what do we tell them? Asked Director Liu Wei. Elena Vasquez stood at the center of the chamber, in the same position she had occupied when addressing the council months ago. But this time, she wasn't the representative of a species begging for recognition. She was the spokesperson for the civilization that the galaxy desperately needed. We tell them the truth, she said, her voice carrying across the chamber with quiet authority. We tell them that we are exactly what they said we were. We are violent when threatened, territorial when cornered, and short-sighted when our survival is at stake. We are predators from a death world, and we wage war as easily as we breathe. The pause that followed was heavy with meaning. But we also tell them that we are protectors of the innocent, healers of the sick, and builders of the future. We are the children who grew up while they weren't looking, and we are the primitives who learned to be civilized without losing our strength. And then, asked Dr. Chen. Elena's smile was neither kind nor cruel, but something far more dangerous. It was the smile of someone who had finally been proven right. And then we save their galaxy. Because that's what humans do. We save people, even when they don't deserve it. Even when they hate us for it. Even when they'll probably go back to dismissing us as primitives once the crisis is over. The vote was unanimous. Humanity would answer the Council's call for help. But this time, they would do it as equals, not as supplicants. The galaxy had learned that dismissing humanity was a mistake it could not afford to make again. As the human fleets prepared to launch their rescue missions, as the medical teams gathered their research, as the security forces prepared to restore order to the chaos, one thing was clear: the galaxy would never be the same. The Council's age of arrogant superiority was over, and humanity's age of reluctant leadership had begun. The predators from the death world had finally shown the galaxy what they were truly capable of when their rage erupted, and the Council, humbled by their own mistakes, would spend the rest of their existence grateful that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their capacity for violence, but their capacity for forgiveness. 5 years after the crisis, the galaxy had settled into a new equilibrium. The Galactic Council still existed, but its composition had changed dramatically. Humanity held not just membership, but leadership positions in every major committee. The species that had once dismissed them as primitive children now sought their approval for major decisions. The phage had been cured using human medical techniques that the Council had once considered crude. The trade routes were safe again, protected by human security forces that had proven their worth 1,000 times over. The infrastructure that had collapsed was rebuilt using human engineering principles that prioritized reliability over elegance. Ambassador Elena Vasquez, now the first human elder counselor in galactic history, stood in the same chamber where she had once been humiliated. Around her, the representatives of 100 species listened respectfully as she outlined humanity's latest proposal for interspecies cooperation. We are not perfect, she said, her words carrying the weight of earned authority. We are still violent when threatened, still territorial when cornered, still short-sighted when our survival is at stake. But we have learned to be more than our worst impulses, and we have learned that true strength comes from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. In the gallery, watching the proceedings, sat the beings who had once dismissed humanity with such casual arrogance. Counselor Xthai, his forearms now permanently scarred from the battles he had fought during the chaos, nodded respectfully at Elena's words. Counselor Vorthak, whose silicon-based form had been rebuilt after a pirate attack, listened with the attention of someone who had learned the cost of underestimating others. Even Elder Counselor Handar, ancient beyond measure, had been humbled by the events of the past years. His crystalline form, once rigid with certainty, now moved with the careful consideration of someone who had learned that wisdom and age were not the same thing. The galaxy had learned its lesson. Humanity's rage had erupted not because they were primitive, but because they were proud. Not because they were violent, but because they were strong. Not because they were children, but because they had grown up while no one was watching. And in the end, the Council had realized that their greatest mistake wasn't underestimating humanity's capacity for destruction. It was underestimating their capacity for growth, for change, for becoming something greater than they had ever been before. The predators from the Death World had saved the galaxy. And in doing so, they had proven that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from the power to destroy, but from the wisdom to know when to show mercy. The galaxy was in good hands, human hands,